Once upon a time, there was a man named Michael. He was just like any other person. He had a family, friends, and a job. But Michael wasn't happy. He wanted more. He wanted to be rich, and he wanted it fast. He was tired of working hard every day and never having enough money to live the life he dreamed of. His neighbors had nice cars, beautiful houses, and expensive things. Michael looked at them and felt jealous. Why did they have all of that? Why not him? One day, Michael overheard a conversation between two men in his neighborhood. They were talking about a money ritual. This ritual, they said, could make anyone rich overnight. All you had to do was follow a special process, and in return, you would get all the money you could ever want. Michael's heart started to race. Could this be the answer to his prayers? Was this the shortcut he had been searching for? Michael decided to meet with the men who knew about the ritual. He asked them to tell him everything. They spoke of powerful spirits, dark magic, and sacrifices. They told him he would need to give something precious in exchange for the riches. Michael thought about it. What's the worst that could happen? He asked himself. Little did he know, this was the beginning of his nightmare. The more Michael heard about the ritual, the more he was drawn in. He wanted money so badly that he started to believe the promises the men made. They told him that he would get everything he ever dreamed of, but only if he was willing to make a sacrifice. At first, Michael thought about his family, but he didn't want to lose them. So, they told him he could sacrifice something else, his own soul. Without fully understanding what this meant, Michael agreed. He felt a rush of excitement. He was ready to do anything to get rich. The men gave him a list of things to gather for the ritual: herbs, animal parts, and mysterious objects. Michael didn't ask too many questions. All he wanted was to see the money come to him. On the night of the ritual, Michael went to a hidden place deep in the forest, just like the men had instructed. The air felt cold, and the darkness around him made his heart beat faster. He could hear strange noises in the wind. But he pushed his fear aside. He was too excited to back out now. As the ritual began, strange symbols were drawn on the ground, and the men chanted in a language Michael couldn't understand. At first, nothing happened. But then, the ground beneath Michael's feet began to shake. A strange energy filled the air. It was as though something was waking up, something ancient and powerful. As the ritual continued, Michael began to feel strange. His body felt hot, and he could hear his heartbeat in his ears. His hands began to twitch, and his skin started to tingle. He tried to move, but his legs felt heavy, as though something was pulling him down. He looked around, but all he could see was darkness. The men were still chanting, their voices now louder and more urgent. Then, the worst thing happened. Michael's skin began to change. He looked at his hands and saw the fingers shrinking, twisting, and turning into something that wasn't human. His nails became long and sharp like claws. He screamed, but no sound came out. His body was changing in front of his own eyes. He tried to run, but his legs had already started to slither like a snake's. His mind was spinning. He wanted to scream for help, but his voice was gone. He couldn't breathe. He tried to move, but his body was no longer his own. Michael felt his heart race, but it was no longer a human heartbeat. It was something cold, something alien. He looked at the men, but they were no longer people to him. They were just shadows, watching as he transformed into something terrible. As Michael's body continued to change, he tried desperately to hold on to his humanity. He remembered his family, his friends, the life he had before all of this madness. No. This can't be happening, he thought, but his body didn't listen. He was no longer a man. He was becoming a snake, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His mind screamed out for help, but his mouth could no longer form words. He was trapped inside his own body, a prisoner of the dark magic that had taken hold of him. The men who had promised him wealth and power were laughing. They had warned him that the ritual would come with a price. Michael had thought he could handle it, but now, as his transformation deepened, he realized that he was paying the highest price possible, his very soul. As he writhed in the dirt, his vision blurred, but one thought kept echoing in his mind: how could I have been so foolish? The desire for wealth had blinded him. He had believed that the ritual would give him everything he wanted, but instead, it had taken everything away from him. He was no longer a man. He was nothing but a creature of darkness, a serpent with no past, no future, and no way out. The pain was unbearable. Michael's body was no longer his own. It felt like every part of him was being twisted, stretched, and reshaped into something unnatural. His mind was racing, but his thoughts were becoming harder to control. The more his body changed, the less human he felt. As he slithered on the ground, his heart filled with regret. He had wanted to be rich, to have the life he always dreamed of. But now, the riches he sought seemed meaningless. What good was wealth if he had lost everything that mattered? His friends, his family, his very humanity, all of it was gone. He tried to fight, tried to claw his way out of the nightmare that surrounded him, but it was no use. The transformation was complete. Michael was no longer a man. He was a snake. And the men who had promised him riches watched in silence, knowing that they had claimed another soul for the darkness. Michael's last human thought was a whisper in his mind: I should have never trusted them. But it was too late now. Now, Michael was no longer just a man cursed by his greed. He was a creature of the night, slithering in the darkness with no hope of ever returning to his old life. Every part of him, from his long, scaled body to the flickering tongue that now hissed from his mouth, was a reminder of the terrible choice he had made. His mind, still sharp and aware, could barely comprehend the full horror of his transformation. How could he live like this? Would he ever feel human again? In his new form, Michael could no longer cry out in sorrow or scream for help. His voice had become a hiss, a language understood only by the darkness that had claimed him. He could feel his memory slipping away as the snake instincts began to take over. It was as if he was being slowly erased from his own mind, swallowed up by the power of the curse that now controlled him. But even as he slithered helplessly in the forest, his heart burned with anger. The men who had tricked him, who had promised him wealth and power in exchange for his soul, were still out there somewhere, watching. They knew what had happened to him. They knew he was a monster now, but they didn't care. They had already moved on to find their next victim. Michael's anger began to build. He wasn't going to let this happen to anyone else. If he could still remember what it was like to be human, he would make sure no one else would fall for the same trap. But how could a snake, cursed and alone, stop a dark ritual? How could he take revenge when he couldn't even speak the words of warning? He slithered through the dark forest, searching for a way to undo what had been done to him, but the pain of his transformation was overwhelming. Every movement felt like it was tearing him apart. As time passed, Michael realized that the transformation wasn't just physical, it was also changing him on the inside. The more time he spent as a snake, the more his human thoughts began to fade. The hunger for wealth that had driven him to the ritual was starting to feel distant, almost unimportant. But the rage remained. As the days passed, Michael became more and more familiar with his new form. The forest had become his home, his prison, and the creatures within it seemed to recognize him, though he no longer felt connected to them. Every movement he made was more fluid, more natural as a snake. His senses had sharpened. He could hear the slightest rustle in the leaves, feel the vibrations in the ground. But with these heightened abilities, Michael realized something unsettling: he could sense the remnants of the ritual. It was like a thread, a dark energy, that lingered in the forest air. He could feel the magic that had turned him into a snake, still alive, still pulsing in the world around him. It made him shiver, but it also gave him hope. If he could trace that energy, maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to break the curse. But would he even be able to hold on to his human thoughts long enough to figure it out? One night, while slithering through the forest, Michael stumbled upon something strange, a stone altar hidden deep within the trees. The air around it crackled with dark energy, and Michael felt a deep chill in his spine. This was no ordinary place. This was the source of the ritual. As he approached the altar, he saw markings on the stone, ancient symbols that looked eerily familiar, the same symbols the men had drawn during the ritual. The realization hit him like a wave. The ritual had not just changed his body. It had tied his soul to this altar, to the dark forces that lived in the shadows. This was where the men had summoned the dark power, and this was where Michael's soul had been claimed. He needed to destroy this altar, or he would remain trapped in his snake form forever. But how could he destroy it? He didn't have the power to fight back. The dark forces were stronger than him, and the longer he spent as a snake, the less human he felt. The altar seemed to pulse with life, as though it were alive, feeding off his despair. Michael's only hope was to find a way to reverse the ritual, to break the connection that had bound his soul to this place. But how? It had been days, weeks, maybe longer, since Michael had been trapped in this snake form. Time felt strange now. It was harder to remember what it was like to be human. But one thing still remained clear in his mind: he could never forget the faces of his family. The memory of his wife, his children, and his friends still burned brightly in his mind, despite the growing distance between them. One night, as Michael lay cowed in the shadows, the haunting memory of their voices echoed in his mind. He remembered their laughter, their love, and the warmth of his family's embrace. He longed for that life again, but it seemed so far away now. His snake form kept him trapped in this dark, lonely world, and the longer he stayed in this state, the more he feared that he would forget what it felt like to be human altogether. But a small part of him still remembered. He remembered the man he used to be, the one who had cared about his family, the one who had dreamed of a better life, but who had made the mistake of chasing wealth at any cost. That man was still there, hidden deep inside. If he could just hold on to that memory, maybe there was a chance. Maybe he could fight back against the darkness. Michael's heart filled with a surge of determination. He could still feel the remnants of his human soul inside him, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. He would find a way to return to his family. He would destroy the altar and undo the curse. But to do that, he needed to outsmart the very forces that had taken his humanity. Michael spent the next few days gathering all his strength, focusing on his human memories. He couldn't let the curse take away the last shred of who he was. He had to fight, not just for himself, but for his family, for everything he had lost. The forest had become his battleground, and the dark forces that held him captive were his enemies. He slithered back to the altar, determined to destroy it. This time, he wasn't just a creature of darkness. This time, he would be a man again, or at least, he would die trying. As he neared the altar, the air grew colder, and the dark energy seemed to react to his presence. The ground trembled beneath him, and the symbols on the stone began to glow. Michael's heart raced. This was it. This was the moment that would decide his fate. He had to destroy the altar. He had to free his soul. But as he approached, the dark power began to fight back, swirling around him, pushing against him. The altar's energy surged, and Michael felt his grip on his human memories beginning to slip. Was he too late? Would the darkness win? Michael's heart raced as the dark energy around the altar grew stronger. The glowing symbols on the stone seemed to pulse with life, drumming with the same power that had twisted his body into a serpent. It was as if the very earth beneath him was alive, reacting to his presence, warning him to turn back. His snake body trembled with the weight of the curse, and yet, deep inside, something still burned, his human will, his refusal to accept defeat. He had come too far to give up now. With all the strength he could muster, Michael slithered forward, determined to reach the altar. His mind screamed in anguish as the dark forces tried to pull him back, trying to weaken his resolve. His body wanted to give in. His thoughts were becoming hazy, like pieces of his past were slipping through his fingers. But he couldn't let it happen. Not yet. As he inched closer, the ground beneath him began to shake violently. The air grew thicker, suffocating, and the darkness seemed to press down on him like a heavy weight. He could feel the power of the ritual fighting against him, trying to push him away. Michael closed his eyes, trying to center himself, to remember who he was, and more importantly, who he used to be. The images of his family flooded his mind, his wife's smiling face, his children's laughter, the warmth of his home. He held on to these memories, focusing on them, feeling the strength that had once made him human. The rage inside him burned brighter, but this time, it wasn't the rage of a man seeking revenge. It was the rage of a man fighting for his life, for his soul. The ground beneath him cracked, and Michael could feel the pulse of dark energy surrounding the altar growing stronger, almost as if it were feeding off his desperation. He had to destroy it. He had to break free before the darkness completely consumed him. With every ounce of strength he could summon, Michael lifted himself toward the altar, his snake body coiling in the air like a spring ready to snap. The symbols on the stone glowed brighter, and he knew that this was the moment of truth. He reached out with his tail, his snake body moving faster than he thought possible, and he struck. The stone cracked as he slammed his tail into it, a burst of dark energy exploding from the altar like a thunderclap. Michael's body writhed in pain as the force of the explosion threw him backward, but he didn't give up. He forced himself to move again, despite the burning agony that consumed him. And then, just as he was about to strike again, a cold, mocking voice echoed from the shadows. The voice came from nowhere, but it was everywhere, swirling around Michael like a storm. He froze, his body still trembling from the blast of dark energy, his mind struggling to keep his human thoughts intact. The voice, deep and cold, spoke again, mocking his efforts. "You think you can stop this? You think you can undo what has already been done," the voice whispered, like a cold wind creeping through his mind. "You are mine now, Michael. Your soul belongs to me. The ritual is complete. There is no going back." Michael's heart sank. He knew the voice. He didn't want to believe it, but he recognized it. It was the voice of the men who had tricked him. They had summoned this dark force, this power, and now it was using their voices to torment him. Michael tried to fight back, to reject the words, but the more he struggled, the more the voice seemed to twist into something darker, something that gnawed at his very soul. "Do you remember the price you paid?" the voice whispered, now mocking. "You wanted power, wealth, and fame. You wanted it all, and now it's yours, just not in the way you imagined." Michael's thoughts blurred as the voice continued to echo in his mind, drowning out everything else. It was like the world was closing in on him, and the weight of the ritual, the curse, was threatening to crush him entirely. But through the fog, one thought broke through: the memory of his family. His wife and children, the people he loved more than anything in the world. No matter what this dark voice said, Michael refused to forget them. They were his anchor, the last connection he had to his humanity. With all the strength he had left, he fought to keep hold of that memory, pushing back against the darkness trying to consume him. "I will not give in," he whispered, though his voice came out as a faint hiss. "I will not let you win." The voice laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "You already have. You are mine. And no one can save you." But Michael's resolve was unshaken. He may have lost his body, but his spirit was still his own. And he would fight for it. The struggle for Michael's soul had only just begun. As the dark voice taunted him, he could feel the power of the ritual tightening around him like a noose. But he was determined now. The anger that had once consumed him, the greed that had led him down this path, had been replaced with something far more powerful: hope. Hope for redemption. Hope for his family. Hope that, even in his serpent form, he could still save himself. Michael knew that to truly break the curse, he needed to destroy the source of the ritual, the altar, the dark magic, the very force that had turned him into a snake. But how could he defeat something so powerful? Something that had already claimed his soul? He had no answers. But he had one thing left: his will. His refusal to give in. And for the first time since the ritual began, Michael understood something. The darkness could take his body, his memories, and even his voice, but it could never take his determination. That was the one thing that still belonged to him. The ground beneath him trembled again, and Michael knew that time was running out. The dark magic was closing in on him, sensing his defiance. The altar was growing stronger, feeding off the fear and despair that threatened to overwhelm him. But Michael could feel something else too, a shift, a faint crack in the dark energy. It was small, but it was enough. He had one last chance to break the curse. With a sudden surge of energy, Michael launched himself toward the altar once more. His snake body moved faster than ever before, coiling and striking with the force of everything he had left. The symbols on the altar began to crack, the dark power recoiling, as though it were in pain. And then, with a deafening roar, the altar exploded into a shower of dark sparks. The magic that had held him captive began to unravel. Michael could feel it, the weight on his soul, the curse that had bound him for so long, finally beginning to loosen. But was it enough? Would this final strike truly free him? The explosion of dark energy sent shockwaves through the forest. The ground trembled violently as the ancient altar cracked, splitting in two. Michael, now barely clinging to his remaining sense of self, was thrown backward by the force. His snake body slammed into the earth with a bone-jarring impact, and for a moment, he thought he had failed. The air around him was filled with the sounds of snapping branches, the crackling of burning symbols, and the growing silence that followed. The forest had been awakened by the blast. The dark magic that had once filled the air was now swirling around him, chaotic and wild. Michael could feel it, a flicker of something that had been buried deep within him, beginning to stir again. A spark. His human will had not entirely been erased. He wasn't done yet. Slowly, painfully, Michael pulled himself to his feet, if you could call them feet anymore. His serpent body still felt strange and foreign, and every movement was met with resistance, as though the darkness itself was trying to drag him back down into it. But the ritual had begun to unravel. He could feel it. The dark magic that had held him captive was no longer as strong, and as it began to lose its grip, Michael's human thoughts started to return more clearly. He knew he couldn't waste any more time. The men who had cursed him, the ones who had set this whole twisted plan in motion, were still out there. They hadn't come to stop him. They hadn't even cared about the destruction of the altar. But if they were still alive, if they were still part of this dark pact, they were still a danger, both to him and to anyone else foolish enough to seek their power. The shadows around Michael seemed to shift, their movements erratic and wild, as if they, too, were reacting to the breaking of the curse. In that instant, Michael realized something: he wasn't alone. The creatures of the forest, the animals, the birds, the insects, had been watching him this entire time. And now, they were waiting for him to act. He needed to use the last remnants of his power to confront the source of his misery, the dark magic that had corrupted his soul. The ritual's energy was still very much alive in the world around him. But instead of it pushing him away, Michael began to draw strength from it. He could feel the dark power still trying to pull at him, but now, he would turn it against itself. He closed his eyes and focused on the remnants of the ritual. His senses sharpened, and through his connection to the forest, to the power that had transformed him, he could feel the pulse of the ritual's energy as it sought to return to the men who had started it. They were the ones who had summoned it. They were the ones who had made the deal. And if Michael could destroy their connection to the dark forces, he could break the curse once and for all. But how? How could a creature like him, now a serpent, broken and torn, possibly reach those men? The thought of facing them filled him with dread. He had no way of communicating. His voice was no longer his own. He was too far gone. But even so, Michael had learned something during this dark time. His mind was still strong, and the power of his will was something the darkness could not fully control. That realization gave him the strength he needed. With renewed resolve, Michael set off, slithering through the forest, feeling the energy of the curse guiding him toward its source. The men who had cursed him might have believed they were safe, far from the forest, but Michael knew better now. The ritual had bound them all, him, the altar, and the very magic they had summoned, together. All he needed to do was find them, confront them, and use the last of his power to undo what they had done. The forest was eerily silent as Michael moved through it, the trees and shadows watching him with an uncanny awareness. He could sense their eyes on him, but he didn't care anymore. He wasn't the man who had fallen for their lies. He wasn't the desperate man who had given up everything for the sake of greed. He was a survivor, a creature who had fought to hold on to his humanity, who had faced the darkest forces and lived to tell the tale. And now, he was ready to make things right. Michael's journey was long and arduous. The deeper he traveled into the forest, the more the dark magic seemed to guide him, leading him to the very place where the men who had cursed him were hiding. His snake body had grown used to the forest terrain, and he was moving with greater speed, more confidence. But with each passing moment, the dark magic grew stronger again, wrapping itself around him like an invisible chain, reminding him that it was always there, watching. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of twisting and turning through the shadows, Michael arrived at the clearing. It was a place that seemed oddly familiar, even though he had never been here before. The clearing was surrounded by towering trees with leaves that shimmered in the moonlight. The air was thick with magic, and the smell of burning incense and herbs filled the air. It was here, the place where the men had performed the ritual, the place where everything had started. Standing in the middle of the clearing were the two men. They hadn't noticed him yet. Their backs were turned, and they were engaged in some kind of dark ceremony, chanting quietly as they gathered strange, glowing objects around them. Michael could feel the power radiating from them. The ritual was still alive in the air, still pulsing with dark energy. For a moment, Michael hesitated. He had come so far, and now, as he stared at the men, a deep sense of rage welled up inside him. They had ruined his life. They had taken his family, his humanity, and twisted it all for their own selfish gain. His mind buzzed with anger, but this time, he didn't let it control him. He had learned to be patient, to think. And now, more than anything, he needed to act. As he slithered closer, he knew that there was only one way to truly end this. He had to destroy the men and the magic before it could do any more damage. But first, he had to make them see the consequences of their actions. He had to make them understand that the power they sought came at a terrible price. And he, Michael, was the living proof of that price. The story you've just read is a journey of transformation, not only in the physical sense but also in the psychological and emotional realms. It's a tale about the dangerous consequences of greed, the thirst for power, and the cost of seeking shortcuts in life, especially when it comes to the pursuit of wealth. Michael's descent into darkness was a result of his desire for wealth at any price, a temptation that many people, in different ways, can relate to. In his search for quick riches, he sacrificed his humanity, his family, and eventually, his very soul. This story reminds us that when we try to take shortcuts, especially when it involves unethical choices or rituals, we often find ourselves lost in the very thing we were trying to escape. However, Michael's story doesn't end in hopelessness. His fight to regain his humanity, even after being cast, shows the power of redemption. It illustrates that no matter how far we've fallen or how much we've lost, there is always the possibility of change. It is never too late to choose a different path, to seek healing, or to begin again. This story is a cautionary tale and an inspiring one, showing that the path to true wealth isn't through magical shortcuts or rituals, but through hard work, integrity, and the love of those we care about. It's a reminder that while we may face difficult and even seemingly insurmountable challenges, the journey to healing and redemption is possible if we make the conscious decision to take control of our destiny. In the end, How a Man Turned to a Snake is more than just a story about a supernatural transformation. It's about the power of choice, the consequences of our actions, and the strength within us to rewrite our own stories. Michael's journey teaches us that no matter how deep we fall, we always have the ability to rise again, stronger, wiser, and more determined to follow a path that leads us to real, lasting peace. Thank you for reading this story. I hope it serves as both a warning and a source of inspiration for anyone facing the temptation to take the easy way out. The true magic, after all, lies in the choices we make and the lives we build, not in any ritual, but in the power of our own actions. I trust you enjoyed this video. Please like and share your thoughts in the comment section, give a thumbs up, and subscribe to this channel for more alluring stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next video.